Delightful to have you all here. My name is Mike Scott. I'm the program director at Farm Table Foundation. Our mission is to build local food culture, and we seek to rekindle connections between people and local food, farmers, and the land. Many of you may know about us through our restaurant in Amory, where we have some great take and bake options now, and also provisions, including, by the way, provisions for baking, so flour and such. If you can't find flour at the store, we do have it at Farm Table Restaurant. So a couple more people to admit. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the class on sourdough baking with Sylvia. Sylvia is our board chair. She's also on the board of Moses, a Midwestern Organic Sustainable Education Services. So she's very involved in local food issues. She's also a grass-fed beef farmer and has done a lot of baking as well. So Sylvia, would you like to just take it away and introduce yourself a little more and say a few words, and we'll get going. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Mike, and welcome to everyone. It's such a pleasure to be able to Zoom again with you, and hopefully one of these days we'll be able to meet one another face to face and get up to our elbows in some flour, because that's something that really you can enjoy. As Mike said, my husband and I raise grass-fed, grass-finished beef here in Western Wisconsin. But like many of you, I didn't start out as a farmer. I, in fact, grew up in the Bronx and came out to the upper Midwest as a television and radio news reporter a long time ago. I loved it out here, so here's where I stayed. And I've been a baker for, let's say, 4 or 5 decades. And have been teaching baking for the last 10 to 12 years. So this is fun. Like you, however, I am a forever student of how to bake and how to bake better. So I guess I'd like to start out with a couple of questions to you. I hope you can find the chat box wherever you are. I think it might be just at the lower portion of your screen. And I'd like to know, what city and state are you zooming in from? Just type them in there. And I'd love to know too, are you a baker? Have you baked before? Do you know sourdough? If in fact you would consider yourself an intermediate or really good baker, please don't be shy and indicate that as well. Because I would suspect there are lots of you who can help answer questions as questions come into the chat box, and that would be terrific. The third thing I want to ask you is, did you attend the first sourdough class? And that one focused on how to make the sourdough starter. Let me know. Now, if you didn't attend it, never fear. It is now on the Farm Table Foundation's YouTube channel. So you can go there and take a look at the Zoom that was done, and also at the documents that we shared. The documents that are about how to make sourdough starter, and also some of the basics about bread and about flour.
Sylvia, can I interject a minute?
Sure.
This is Mike. I wanted to just mention there's a whole range here of beginners to more advanced bakers. Some say baking is their favorite food group. One person did. But it's pretty cool. We have people from Toronto, Singapore, California, Boston, Raleigh. So and of course a lot from Minnesota and Wisconsin.
Man, that makes me feel great, because I'm feeling like I've got tendrils out to all those parts of the world. We can't get on a plane right now, but it's so good to connect with you via this class. Thank you so much for joining us.
And quite a few, Sylvia, did take the first class, but certainly not everybody. So just so you know that. And then, yeah, folks, if you go to YouTube and search Farm Table Foundation, you'll see Sylvia's first class on making sourdough starter.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us again. You know, sometimes doing something like this via Zoom, being involved in a class where usually when I teach a class in sourdough, it's a 4 and 5 hour class, and everybody gets their hands into the dough so that you can feel the progress from starter to finished loaf. Well, we're challenged on Zoom, but that doesn't mean that we can't meet the challenge. And in fact, one of the things I think we're going to do right off the bat, before I demonstrate anything here, is we're going to take a look at some slides. And there are not a lot of slides, so never fear. We're going to take a look at some slides that provide you with a really good picture of the steps that we're going to try to demonstrate, at least in some form, here live during the Zoom. So Mike, could you kind of pull us into the slides?
Sure thing. So I'm going to share my screen, folks. And again, as we go along, if you have questions, of course, just add them into the chat box and we'll try and stop periodically to take questions.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, and while these slides are running, I will just do a small narration. So this class is about going from the ripe starter to the finished loaf. We can advance now. All right, the first step in making your bread is to mix the starter with the water, with the flour. And that first step is not to make a smooth dough, but something called a shag dough. And if you take a look at that photo, that's what it looks like. It looks like a shaggy piece of carpeting or something. It's rough, and it's a first stage where you're mixing the water and the dough, and what you're trying to do is give the flour and water some chance to settle with one another. You're looking for the flour to soak up the water. That's called hydrate. All right, let's go to the next one. Okay, so here we've got a few steps that we take. After that shag dough has been made, what you do is actually you give it 20 to 60 minutes to just sit under usually a plastic wrap so that you don't lose moisture. And the amount of time that you let it sit and soak up water, which is called an autolyse, it depends on how much whole wheat flour there is in your initial mix. So the more whole wheat flour you've got in your bread recipe, the longer your autolyse is. So you do this, you cover it, and you let it sit for 20 to 60 minutes. It's soaking up water during that time. Then you pull off your plastic wrap or whatever you've used in order to act as a moisture barrier, and you add salt and a little bit, a splash more of water. And you mix these thoroughly. And this interesting thing is that once you add this additional water and salt, and you start mixing it together with your hands, it starts to feel almost like mud going through your fingers. And that's what you see demonstrated in that photo. It's just squishing through my fingers like really wet mud. And what you do is you mix this over and over again by hand. We're not using any kind of machines for this kind of bread. You're mixing it by hand, you're picking it up, you're squishing it, you're folding it over on itself. And after a while, the dough really changes. It goes from this wet mixture to something with a whole lot more cohesiveness. It becomes a single unit of dough. At this point, we transfer that very changed dough to a big plastic container, and we let it go through what is called the first fermentation. In sourdough and in baking, if you've done a lot of it, one of the things that you know is that you call those rise times fermentation because of the activity that's happening within the dough. It's being fermented by the activity of the yeast and by bacteria as well, because sourdough is about both the activity of yeast as well as the activity of bacteria to create the flavor and the rise of your dough. So you have a first fermentation and you have a second fermentation. And so you put it into a container for your first, and it's usually a 4-hour fermentation. During this time, you do not knead the dough. This dough is never kneaded the way that maybe you're familiar with, where you pick the dough and you pull it out of your bowl and you slap it on a counter. And you push on it, you push it on, and push on it for, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes. French mild sourdough does not require any of that kind of activity. It is the combination of time and the high hydration of this dough and some gentle folds every 30 to 45 minutes that really create the strength in your dough. And why do you need strength in your dough? You need it so that the carbon dioxide that's produced by the yeast can be captured by that strong dough, and the dough will rise to create a lofty loaf. Okay, the next slide. Okay, so I mentioned that you've got your dough in a container for 4 hours, and what you do is fold the dough. And that's an action that I will demonstrate when we come off of this slideshow. Folding the dough is just picking up, leaving that dough actually in your container or in your bowl, and picking up the corners and folding it on themselves 2 or 3 times, and then letting it rest for 35 minutes, then doing it again. And that activity alone builds the strength in your dough. In fact, take a look at that photo. That is dough that has been stretched and folded gently, not very hard. And you see those, what look like strings going across the face of that dough? Now, those are strands of gluten. And gluten is what gives the bread, the final bread loaf, the strength to hold in the gases produced by the yeast. So when we talk about sourdough bread, the kind of bread that I am talking about, and I know other people can have different variations, it is one based on wheat flour, and wheat flour does contain gluten. And that's what makes this formula, not a recipe, bakers talk about formulas versus recipes, that's what makes this formula work. Okay, next. Mike, let me ask, are there any questions right now about what we've gone through?
You know, I'm not able to escape to see the chat box right now, I'm sorry to say.
Well, that's okay, because this slideshow is short. We'll get through it.
Yeah.
And we've got your questions, so we will answer them before going on.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, one of the things that you can do to still create strength in that dough, if you don't fold it, I'm giving you an alternative method, is to actually put the dough in a cool, very cool place for anywhere from 8 to 12 hours. And that time alone, in combination with the yeast and the hydration, the water in the dough, will rise the dough. So when you take a look at the photos right now, the upper right-hand corner is a shot of the dough that first went into the canister. When you take a look at the bottom, you'll notice that this dough has risen by 100%. It's now 2 inches tall instead of 1 inch, after spending a full night at 54 degrees in my root cellar. I pulled that dough out of the root cellar and then put it on the counter. And you can see that the dough rose an additional, almost 3/4 of an inch, so that we have the dough building its own strength, even without the folding. I did this because, one, to show you that it is an alternative, but also because I didn't want to stay up all night making bread. And this, in fact, is one of the strategies you can use to bend the sourdough schedule to your life schedule. All right, next. All right, so after your fermentation, this is what the top of that dough looks like. I'm peering down into the container, so you can see that there are bubbles on the surface. There are also bubbles throughout the dough. And as it says right here, this step can take 4 to more hours, depending on the temperature of your room. So if you've got a really cold kitchen, anticipate that some of these things are going to take longer. If you're living in a place that really has a much warmer climate, this too will be a challenge because the yeast will work faster and your dough will rise that much faster. In fact, I've often heard from people who live in tropical climates that making sourdough is a challenge because of the heat. And just as a point of information, you may not be aware, or maybe some of you are, that most cookbooks and most spread books anticipate or assume rather that your kitchen is operating at 72 degrees. And so if you're doing something and my goodness, why isn't my bread coming out as quickly as the recipe says? If you've got a cold kitchen, that might be the reason. Okay, let's go forward. All right, after that 4 hours, I dumped the dough out onto the counter. That's what you see on the left. And look at two things, I guess, in that photo. One, you can see those really strong ropes of gluten. The other thing you'll notice as you go down that photo are those bubbles of carbon dioxide. This is a lively dough. It is just raring to become bread. And on the right, I've taken that dough and pre-shaped it. So when you shape your loaf, you actually very often do it in 2 steps. You pre-shape it and then you shape it. And again, if you take a look at the surface of that dough, it is covered in bubbles. Okay, let's go. Okay, so we pre-shaped it and then we shaped it, and I will demonstrate these things. And now we are ready to have our dough go through its second rise or second fermentation. And what you see here is that I've taken that shaped loaf and I've put it into a basket, a wicker basket that's been really well dusted with flour. That basket is called a banneton. It's also been called a broth form. And it's certainly something that sort of gives those pretty designs to the finished loaf. I put it into the floured banneton, and then I covered it with a piece of plastic that's been oiled so that the plastic doesn't stick to that dough once you want to take it off. If you forget to oil that plastic, oh man, it becomes really difficult to take that plastic off. Okay, so now it's ready for its second rise. Well, that second rise or fermentation can be on your counter for 4 hours, 3 or 4 hours, or you can put it into your refrigerator for 12 to 16 hours. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, one, it gives you an opportunity to bend this whole process to the busyness in your life. And two, it does change the flavor of your bread. Why? Because the longer water is in contact with flour, the more the sugars break down and become available to the yeast. And yeast feed on sugars. And so you begin to develop a much more complex flavor in your dough. And again, the flavor in your sourdough is not only due to the yeast, it's due to the bacteria and the kind of relationship that they share within the sourdough. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, well, it's been 4 hours, or it's been 12 to 16 hours, and your dough is sitting in the fridge or sitting on the counter. Now it's become time to bake. Well, an hour before your bread is ready to bake, you turn your oven on and you preheat it to 500 degrees. And when you do that, you've got your cloches, those are those bell-shaped clay pots, your Dutch ovens, pizza stones, or pizza steels in the oven. They're heating up with the oven as you heat it up. And you're going to be preheating for a good half hour so that everything is really hot. Why? Because this helps with oven spring. It's that wonderful thing that you experience when you put your sourdough loaf into the oven. And when you pull it out, it's so much higher than it was when you initially put it in. It's a great feeling. All right, now, if you decide to use a pizza stone or a steel in order to bake your bread, one of the things that you want to do is provide moisture in your oven so that your bread will not form a crust too quickly. All right, you want moisture on your bread, moisture in the oven, so that the dough will rise up as much as it can before the crust begins to harden. And that's why we put an old baking pan at the bottom of the oven, so that when you put your dough on your pizza stone or your steel, you then pour a cup of water into that old baking pan. It will steam, it will hiss, it will crackle, it will make noises as it bends, and it will provide the steam needed so that you can get the maximum rise, or oven spring, they call that, while you're there. It's also why people use Dutch ovens and cloches. Cloches, I'll show you a picture of one of those. A cloche is a clay vessel with a cover. And the reason why you use that is also to capture steam, so that the steam that comes off the bread, so that you can get maximum rise. Okay. Okay, so the oven is hot. It's ready for you to bake. What do we do next? Well, remember that we had some plastic over the top of the dough that was sitting in that banneton? Well, first, remove the plastic. Believe me, I have baked things and forgotten to remove the plastic, and it's not a fun thing to watch as plastic melts. So remove the plastic, and then we're going to cover that same dough. It's still in the brat form, it's still in the banneton, it's still in whatever basket you have it. And we're going to put a sheet of parchment paper over it. So that's what you see in the lower right. Why? Because what we're going to do is now flip that basket over and have it sit on a peel, a pizza peel. Those things that you take pizzas in and out of the oven. Yours might be metal, it could be wood. If you don't have one, you can use the back of a baking sheet. But we're doing that so that the parchment paper and the dough go on the peel. And then you take your little spritzer bottle and you really spritz that dough well. One of the things I wanted to tell you is that you're doing this at as fast as you can, because you don't want that dough to spread too much before you stick it into the oven. So you spritz it down quickly. You're not trying to give it a bath. You're just trying to moisten it down. And the next slide. And then you score your loaf. Now, you can score it after you wet it down, or you can score it before you wet it down. You decide how you want to do it. This is not critical. But you score the loaf quickly. I tend to use a single-edged razor. Lots of people use a tool called a lame, which is a razor. You can use a serrated knife. You can use a really super duper sharp knife. And you make cuts about 1/4 inch deep. And then you're ready to place this in the oven. Okay, let's go. Again, here we've got a picture of some of my cloches. Now on the left, what you see is a picture of that same loaf that on the peel, it's great to have that parchment paper on the peel because it slides that loaf really easily into that cloche. You don't have to touch it with your hands. You slide it into that cloche. And then upper right, you can see where I've put the covers of those cloches back on. Because again, we want to capture that moisture. We want to keep it on that loaf so that it will rise as much as it can before it hardens. And on the lower right, what you see is the lids taken off of those cloches after the first 20 minutes of baking. So these loaves are baked with covers on for 20 minutes, and then the covers are pulled off for the remainder of the baking time. And for most of my mild sourdough loaves, the baking time usually adds up to 20 minutes under the lid and then another 15 minutes with the lid off. And in order to get that loaf to kind of be evenly browned all over, what I do is after the lids come off, I let them bake still in the cloche bottom for 10 minutes. Then I open the oven, tip the loaves out of the cloches, and let them sit in the oven for another 5 minutes so that there's more even browning. And if you see that some of the areas have become, you know, one end has become browner than the other, you can turn these around. Okay, next. Well, how do we know if the loaf is done? I use a thermometer. I really do not trust just thumping the loaf on the bottom. Some people might be really expert at that. I guess I don't trust it because I make a basic mild French sourdough, but I use that basic dough and make many, many variations. Some of them are fairly wet additions, like the loaf that you see right there in that picture. That's a loaf filled with Kalamata and green olive, which can be pretty wet. So I really do use a thermometer to make sure that this loaf has been baked all the way through. And what you want is a reading on your instant read thermometer of at least 200 degrees. 200, 202, 204. Those are the sweet spots I usually go for. I'm kind of surprised that this one went up to 210, but that's how it turned out this morning. So we're done. And what you see on the right, there we go, here it comes, are the final loaves. So I made 2 loaves of Kalamata and green olive bread this morning, but I've got other breads to show you as well. Do you have to use a cloche? Do you have to use a Dutch oven? No. You can actually use a regular bread pan and get wonderful, wonderful bread from that. Okay, we're done with that slideshow. Why don't we take some questions, Mike?
Okay, let's see. Let me get down to the end here. Can I bake in a cast iron pot that has a dark interior as opposed to the light colored one like Le Creuset? And what's the best way to keep the dough off?
Absolutely. You can use the color of the material will affect it only in that sometimes the darker pots get hotter, faster. And if you're using cast iron, obviously it will hold in heat, which is something that you actually want. The reason why I don't use cast iron is because handling those cast iron Dutch ovens and trying to flip bread into a really steeply sided Dutch oven, I'm just afraid of getting burned. And so that's why I tend to use a different kind of vessel. But yes, cast iron works beautifully.
Okay. I've got a question here about the starter, actually. I fed my starter and it rose, then fell in about 2 hours. I don't want to start. Why do I feed it again?
Okay. Starters can be kind of tough to, well, let me ask you this. Let me pose the question. So maybe, Mike, you can kind of monitor the answer to this question. Your starter, was it really, 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 really bubbly? Did we get an answer?
Not yet.
Okay. Well, let me just throw this out. It might be hard to find that answer.
Yes, starter was bubbly.
The starter was bubbly. Okay. A starter can be bubbly to different degrees. Something that's got some bubbles on the top may not be a very strong starter. What you need to have is a starter that, as you look at it, after a minute or so, you will actually see bubbles bursting at the top. That means that you have to keep an eye on it, and also understand that once your starter reaches its peak, it will begin to fall. So when it reaches its peak, it may be at that peak for only an hour or two. And you think, oh my goodness, that's way too finicky. I'm not going to be chained to the starter sitting and looking at my counter to see how, if it reaches the peak. And I don't blame you. I wouldn't want to be chained either. But it does take planning. So if you want starter to begin making your bread at 9 o'clock in the morning, you need to be able to count backwards and make your starter a really thick batter starter about 10 hours before. 10 hours, maybe even 12 hours. I know I started my starters yesterday, and I thought, how am I ever going to keep these starters really, really effective for this class at 6 in the evening? Because I don't usually start baking at 6 in the evening, but this is what I did. And so again, this is about using time and temperature so that your starter will be ready when you are. A thing that you can do when you're making your starter is to make it very thick. It will take longer to rise. The other thing you can do is you make your starter, you leave it on your counter for 2 to 3 hours, and then you stick it in the fridge overnight until whenever you need it. Pull it back out and then let it continue to rise. I would not mix a starter and immediately stick it in the fridge because it simply will not have enough activity in it to sustain it really well. But after two or 3 hours on your counter and then sticking it in the fridge, you're more likely to have something that you can use. I started my starters yesterday, and then I stuck them into, I had them rise in a cool root cellar at 54 degrees. And I thought, oh man, these starters are going to fall before 6 o'clock this evening. So this morning, I then stuck them in the fridge and then took them out so that they'd be at their peak. Let me just do something. So these are two starters that spent some time in cool and then spent some time in cold. And what I'm going to do is, as we get to the demonstrations, is I'm going to show you what that really bubbly starter looks like. There is a picture of it at the beginning of this slideshow that you saw. That first slide is of a really bubbly starter. Mike, I don't know if you're still there.
Oh yeah, I've got a whole other list of questions, but I know you also have it's about 25 to 7. So just
okay.
Your use of time, and there are some other questions though.
Okay, well, when this Zoom is over, you're going to have access to the Zoom recording and that slideshow that we showed. And you will see that bubbly, bubbly starter. That's what we're looking for, really vigorous bubbles. And you're looking then for a starter that will float on water. So we're actually going to go there right now. What does this process look like? You saw it in the slide. I'm going to show you right now. We're going to quickly go through this process so that you can see what it looks like in actuality. What I've got in front of me here is a big metal bowl, and it is sitting on a digital scale. In baking, you weigh things. You do not measure things out by volume, because a cup of flour from one manufacturer or milling house will weigh differently from a cup of flour from another milling house. The weight of the flour might also fluctuate, or rather the volume of the flour might also fluctuate by the age of the flour. And so everything is done by weight so that it can be more precise, because as we said, this is not a recipe, this is a formula. And when you talk to professional bakers, they do things by weight. Now, I weigh everything by grams. Why? Because it's so much more precise than ounces. Consider this, 1 ounce is equal to 28.35 grams. So think of the precision that you can get. That said, I know a lot of people do this in very different ways. There is no one way. I'm showing you the way that I tend to do it. I've got this big bowl. Now I'm going to put in 700 grams of water. And I put in a little too much water. So I'm going to take some out because, again, it's a formula. There we go, 700. Now I'm going to add the sourdough starter. This is a really, really, really bubbly flour, bubbly starter. I'm trying to think if I can even show you. I don't think I can actually show you this up close. It's not going to show. So please refer to the slides. I'm pouring out 200 grams of starter. So here's the ratio, 700 grams of water, 200 grams of starter. All right. And one of the things that you'll notice right away is that the starter floats. That is an indication that you've got something strong. It doesn't partially sink, it fully floats. All right. So now what do? Oh, I take my finger, or you can take a spoon, and I swirl it and break up that starter and mix it up really well. Okay, and then for this recipe, excuse me, this formula, this formula calls for 1,000 grams of flour. So I like to make my French sourdough with a 30% ratio of whole wheat. So I've got 700 grams of white bread flour and 300 grams of whole wheat, and I just dump those in. Take my spoon, and I mixed. And now what we're trying to achieve, and we'll try to do it quickly, I'm trying to achieve the shag stage. This is going to take, it'll take a good 3 to 4 minutes. And again, it's not an effort to make a really smooth dough at this point. It's just to get a ragged dough so that I can give that flour time to absorb water and to interact with the starter. Well, this is really shaggy, and it's very much like the picture that you had on your slides. I'll try to lift this up and see if there's any way of getting a picture of it on Zoom. But it's pretty rough. It's a rough shag. And what I'm going to do now is actually wet my hands and go through the flour just a little bit. I'm not trying to smooth it out. All I'm trying to do at this stage is find any pockets of dry flour and just mix them in so that we don't have any kind of lumps left on the bottom of this. Like I said, this is not a bread that requires kneading. but it does require that you kind of get your hands into it. Okay, this is just about done. I got enough. Very, very sticky at this point. This is called a high hydration kind of dough. That means it's got a lot of water. And having a lot of water is what yields a loaf that's going to have those beautiful big holes actually within the crumb, and will help develop a very nice crust for you. So I'm trying to pull off these bits of dough from my hands. And at this point, what I would do is get it ready for the autolyse, right? So I would have this sit for 30 minutes. And I would put a plastic, it almost looks like a shower cap, but this is food grade. You can get them at any grocery store. And I cap it. And I'm going to flip off screen for a moment because I've got to get this dough off my hand. All right. Whew. Okay. And of course, you know that trick that the easiest way to get wet dough off of your hands and off of a bowl or anything like that is to use cold water, not hot. You use cold because hot begins to gelatinize the flour, and that'll make it stick even worse. Okay, so now this sits for 20 minutes. We're going to pretend that it has sat for 20 minutes, and we're going to take our next step. The next step is to go from this shag to a more uniform kind of dough. So I take my salt, and actually what I'm holding up here is a tiny little digital scale. That allows me to be really precise about salt, because what do we know about salt? Salt can come in different kind of grain sizes. Kosher salt is much bigger than, let's say, sea salt or table salt. So a teaspoon of salt of kosher salt is not equal to a teaspoon of sea salt. A teaspoon of sea salt will actually impart a whole lot more saltiness because it's a smaller grain. So we weigh these things in order to make sure that we get the same impact on the dough. So I've sprinkled the salt on this dough. I'm just going to splash. This is about 50 grams of water. And now I take my hands and mush them in to the dough. And it is really like mud. It just squishes right through your fingers. I mean, you remember being a kid and walking in mud and that feeling of the mud going through your toes? Oh, I don't suggest that you do this with your feet, but you are doing it with your hands, and you are manipulating it so that that salt gets really well distributed. Because what do we also know about salt? Salt is a moderating influence on the development of yeast in your bread dough. In other words, if you put too much salt in your bread dough, the yeast will not act well. It will also not act well if you put in a lot of sugar. You have to use a special kind of yeast altogether to have the really sweet dough, something that's been modified just for that. So I am moving this dough around. Again, we have to imagine that we just had it rest for 30 minutes. And the nature of the dough is beginning to change. It is no longer squishing through my fingers. It actually has cohesion. And this takes a good, usually 5 minutes to accomplish. We're working rapidly here now.
And Sylvia?
Yeah.
There's a question about how much salt And
Okay.
then did you add, and also a question about a recipe. I believe what you forwarded to me and I forwarded to people has a recipe in it, right?
Yes, you have the recipe, and the question about how much salt, it's 20 grams of salt. So what we're working with, yeah, sure. What we're working with always when you're making bread, and then when you're making pastries too, you're working with ratios. And in fact, how do you double, or how do you halve, or how do you triple a bread dough recipe? You do it by using what is known as baker's math. And that's a way of looking at the ratio of all of the ingredients to the amount of flour that you're using. And I think you can go online, you can find that out. It's something that's extremely useful. It may seem weird at first, but it works like a charm. Because let's say I had, in fact, I used this yesterday. I had just a little bit of starter. I didn't have enough to make 2 loaves. I didn't have enough to rise 1,000 grams of flour. So what I did was weigh that starter and then figure out how much flour. I weighed the starter and figured out how much water and then how much flour I needed. It lets you fool around that way. Okay, this thing has changed in its nature. It is now much more cohesive. And now I'm going to put it into the container. There. This will be its little home for the next 4 hours. And what I usually do, well, what I usually have to do first is I've got to clean my hands. All right.
Sylvia, time check, it's about 10 to 7.
Okay, we're good. We're good. Okay, so thank you. So during this 4-hour period, what's going to happen? We are going to fold this dough. Remember, we do it every 30 to 45 minutes. So what does that look like? What does it look like to fold dough? Well, you know, in order to really look at this well, I think what I'm going to do is put it into a glass bowl. Hold on. Yeah, sorry about that interruption. Okay, so I'm going to just put this back in a bowl so you can see what folding looks like. And the folding I would do would be taking place in this plastic canister. But for the ease of this Zoom, and for you'll be able to see it, this is what we do. When we fold, and I want to make sure that you can see this. Okay.
That's good.
Should I lift it?
Well, we can see
Can I keep it
now.
Can I keep it on the counter, or should I lift it?
I would work it a little bit and then lift it up.
Okay. You pick up let's say a corner of it, and you fold it towards the middle. You pick up a corner of it, you lift it up, put it towards the middle. And you do that maybe 4 or 5 times every time you fold it. So one fold consists of actually going through this fold motion 3 or 4 times. And that's what a fold is. And that actually develops the strength within this dough. All right. So we do that, as we said, for 3 and 4 hours, a 4-hour rise. So what does it look like at the end of those 4 hours? Well, this is what it looks like. Here is a canister that has dough that's been sitting in it for 4 or 5 hours. And I'm going to let you look at that masking tape marker there. That's the level at which it started, and you see how much it has risen. So what I'm going to do is now pour this out on the counter. And it is a very wet dough, so it is like pouring. And it's kind of goopy. All right. Woo. And it's got lots of bubbles in it. This is a really, really active dough. And what we're going to do is we put it on the counter, you let it sit here for about 5 minutes. Then you sprinkle some flour over it, not a lot, but enough to kind of cover it lightly so that you can handle it. And then you take your bench knife. I use plastic because I don't want to ruin my counter. And you divide the dough. And you do it not by sawing through, but by pressing down. And then you pre-shape the dough. And again, like I said, this is gooey. You pre-shape the dough by lifting it up and folding it over on itself. And even as you do that, it begins to build body. It starts forming shape better. The next one. All right. And you would leave this for a good 15 to 18 minutes before you actually shaped the final loaf. These are still really kind of sticky for that. So what I'm going to do is actually go to a loaf. Let's see. Let's do it this way. I'm going to take a banneton. I'm going to sprinkle it with flour. And what I use, and you may want to consider this, is I use a mixture half flour, half rice flour, because things tend to stick less with the rice flour. Dust it well. Let go of the excess. And again, we're working fast right now. And I'm going to take one of these pre-shaped doughs, pick it up, put it down, cut it down a bit, and shape it onto itself. You're folding it over onto itself, and this thing is so lively, it won't even fold. All right. The more you handle it like this, again, you're handling it gently, but you're actually moving it the way that you want. And I use my bench knife to shape it so that it's fairly tight. Lift it up, put it into the basket. And this was now what will rise for the next 4 hours. My preference is to stick it in the fridge overnight. And I would cover this now with oiled plastic because you don't want to lose that moisture. So what does this look like after it's sat in the fridge or on your counter for 4 hours? This is what it looks like. I've just pulled a loaf out of the fridge. I'm taking the plastic off, following my own advice. And I'm taking a piece of parchment paper. Again, we had talked about that. And I'm putting it on the bread, the dough rather. Not bread yet. I take my trusty peel and I flip this bread onto the peel. And you may get some sticking, I certainly did, of this loaf to the banneton. That'll happen. It's not the end of the world. And this bread, this particular dough is a 30% whole wheat. There you can see the striations on it. You can see the striations from the Benetton on your loaf. I then take a razor blade. And I score it. I'm pretty conventional in my scoring. Some people are like artistes, man. They are so super duper at scoring.
And why do you score it?
You score it so that as the bread rises, it will not tear the top apart, but rather rise around these scores. Then I spritz it. And now I'm going to quickly, I'll be gone for about 20 seconds.
What does the spritzing do, Sylvia?
The spritzing adds moisture that you need so that the crust will not harden so fast that you don't get the maximum oven spring. So it prevents it from getting crusty too fast. And I'm sticking this in the oven.
Sylvia, can you use an egg wash instead of the water spritz?
No, I would not.
Or butter it?
I would prefer the water because an egg wash will also harden. And it may end up encrusting the bread. Okay, now it's in the oven. It's going to be there for 20 minutes. Obviously, our time is over, but what does that bread end up looking like? So I've got some samples here. This is the loaf made with Kalamata olives. Smells really good. And here's a loaf made with einkorn, which is an ancient grain. It has a very different genetic makeup than wheat. It is a wheat, however. It does have some gluten in it. But because of its different chromosomal makeup, some people find it much more digestible. It does act differently than wheat, however, than the wheat that we're aware of. And because of that, it is sometimes a challenge to work with it. I used only 30% einkorn in this loaf of mild French sourdough, and it ended up working out well. I was pleasantly surprised. And that's it. So I guess the last piece of caution is once that loaf comes out of the oven, do you know if it's done? I always take the temperature to make sure. And I love seeing it. It's a great little piece of exercise. Yay, I got it to 204 degrees. Also, you do not cut into that loaf for at least 2 hours because while that loaf is cooling, the internal structure is actually still cooking. And if you cut into it prematurely, you'll end up tearing the structure of the bread. All right, that's it. Mike, were there any other kind of questions that we might answer now?
Well, there were quite a few earlier, but for one, I thank those of you who are bakers and you're weighing in and answering each other's questions. That's really helpful as we go along through the course. I've also put up there our website and our restaurant's phone number in case you're interested in that, folks. But yeah, can you do this recipe in an outside wood oven? Can you include or send how to do variations? I'm not sure all the things in your recipe that you sent.
Okay.
But
the recipe that I sent and that you should have, and if you haven't got it, it'll be sent to you again, does include variations for things like using polenta and pumpkin seed, for rosemary. Let's see, I think there are a couple of other for whole wheat. So there are some variations there on that recipe sheet.
In addition to the outside oven, there was someone else that said, can you use convection or regular bake when you're baking it?
Only regular.
Only regular.
Convection, yes, only regular, because convection will harden the crust too quickly so that you will not get your maximum rise before the crust hardens.
Someone would like to see the inside of one of your loaves, and then also if you have a favorite book or two you could recommend, Sylvia.
Absolutely. I like that question about getting into those loaves, because that's the ultimate challenge for any French sourdough bakers. Like, did she get the holes? Did she get the holes? I'm going to grab a knife and we're going to check it out.
And then can you send us all a loaf?
Oh man, wouldn't that be fun? I'd love to. All right, so the first loaf I'm going to go into is one that, again, it's einkorn, and it's new to me. I'd never really done anything with einkorn. Oh yes. And we've got holes. And again, this was the first attempt with an ancient grain, so I'm pretty happy with it. Then we've got the olive, and this is a much more dense loaf. I would not expect as many holes in it. But look what we've got. We've got holes. Yeah. So that tells us a little bit about the impact of einkorn, or changing to an ancient grain, on this kind of recipe. All right.
And Sylvia, perhaps to wrap up, a couple people are interested in when you add the olives, and also the olive recipe itself, the Kalamata recipe.
Okay.
Perhaps you could send that to me if you.
Yeah, I believe that recipe is on the list, is on the
Okay.
recipe that I gave you. And if it's not, contact me and I will get it to Mike and he can share it. When do I add the olives? I add the olives when the dough goes into the container. I add it then, mix the olives in. Sometimes you can do it immediately. Other people recommend doing it after the first 30 minutes and then adding the olives, well drained, really, really, really well drained. And then the folding becomes a little bit stickier at that point. Once you put in olives, it becomes very squishy again. You have to rework it so that it develops its cohesion again. But it does. It's kind of like magic. It really does. And you continue then with the baking. Was there another question that I missed?
Well, the demo tonight was for 2 loaves. Is that correct?
The demo is for 2 loaves because the recipe that I provided, Mike, and which you have, is for 2 loaves.
Okay, great.
Yep.
And then Sylvia, last time you mentioned your Facebook page. Is that something you'd like to?
Oh, sure. My Facebook, my website is bronxtobarn.com. That's BRONXTOBARN.com.
Great.
And, and I post a lot of pictures of bread on Facebook because it's a lot of fun.
And folks, I will again send out the recipes in case you didn't get them, as well as once we edited this down just a little bit in a couple spots, send a video recording of this if you want to look back at anything as well. So your Facebook, your Facebook name?
The Facebook name is Sylvia Burgos Toftness.
All right.
So that's my full name. Somebody asked for books. 2 that I would recommend, well, actually there's a whole bunch of them, but the top one I'd recommend is Chad Robertson's Tartan Bread Book. It is excellent. In fact, somebody just asked me about it and I took a bunch of pictures of it. Let me just make sure I've got the right title. Yep, it's the Chad Robertson, the Tartan Bread Book. And it's fantastic basic instructions. He is excellent, an excellent teacher. And another one with a very different bent is Sarah Owen's Sourdough. And it's a different scent because she has very creative recipes and also lots of suggestions on what to do with starter that's left over, the discard. And so I've made bundt cakes and I've made scones and I've made this, that, and the other using some of her recommendations. She's really good about that. Another book author that's great is John Hamelman, Bread Techniques. Excellent.
What are you ready?
All right.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us. Particularly thank you, Sylvia, for your generosity tonight.
Oh, my pleasure.
And we will be in
sourdough.
Joe, I think you have your someone unmuted. If you could please mute yourself. Anyway, thank you all for joining us, and we'll be in touch via email with follow-up and so on, and keep abreast of our website. Sylvia will be doing a class on piadina, of a yeastless bread, a week from tonight. So we may see some of you there. And I'll send a link out to that as well.
Well, thanks very much, everyone. Bake a lot of bread.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.